Greetings, everyone. This is Brian Alexander kicking off today's Future Trends Forum. Today's guest is going to be Casey Green. But before we get started, I just want to welcome everyone to the Shindig platform. Thank you for being patient with bandwidth issues and delays. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat box or take a look on the Twitter hashtag for today. So welcome to the third installment of the Future Trends Forum. This is a weekly discussion where we examine trend lines in the present, trying to understand what's happening with the future of education and technology. Next slide, please. This is a project that based off of the Future Trends and Tension project. That's a report that I've been running for the past just about 5 years. It's a monthly environmental scan where we take a look at current trends in order to figure out when they're strongest in the future of education and technology. You can go to ftte.us. You can find past reports as well as ways to sign up. I want to mention one of our sponsors, which is NYSERNet from New York State. They've been generously sponsoring FTTE this year. And I want to thank Shindig for sponsoring and hosting this event. Shindig is running the software. They've created the software that we're using right this moment. A very powerful video conferencing tool. Just very, very quick, what you should be seeing are two windows at the top of the screen. Those are the spotlights. And in a minute, that's going to be myself along with Casey Green. Right now, it's myself and this little slide deck. On the bottom part of the screen, you should see a bunch of icons which represent other people here in this Shindig, other users from literally around the world. Now, as we go, we have a chat box, which is letting people discuss things in chat that they can't say out loud. So if you want to do that, please type in here. And if you can't see the chat box, just mouse over your little icon. You'll see a few different windows pop up. One of them will say, I am chat. That, and you'll see not only the room for everybody in this chat, but also the opportunity to ping individuals here as we go. So as we discuss things, please feel free to throw in questions and comments. I'm going to be asking you to add some there. For a starter, if you'd like to say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. Over on the right edge of the screen, I'll show you this way, you can see in the top right a few different icons that are widgets that will take you to different resources that we've discussed in today's session. On the very bottom right, you can see two little orange bubbles, one that is a raised hand icon that will let you have a question, so we can call on you and bring you up front to speak in audio and hopefully video. And there's an ask button where you can just quickly type in a question for us to see. Now, our guest this week, for this afternoon, for this hour, is Casey Green from the Campus Computing Project. Casey is an important figure in the world of technology and education. He is, among other things, the founder and curator of the Campus Computing Project, which, for my money, is the best source of information on how colleges and universities actually deploy, think about, and strategize digital technologies. He's also the founder of the blog Digital Tweed with Inside Higher Ed, where you can get his opinions and comments about all kinds of issues relating to technology and education. And on the side, just this week, he released a groundbreaking new report about faculty attitudes towards digital technology. We'll be talking about all of these today. And there are links on this slide, links in the widgets on the side as well. So you can find out more about the Campus Computing Project, Digital Tweed, Going Digital, and of course, Casey Green. Casey, greetings. How are things in California?
Brian, good afternoon, and my thanks to all of you in whatever time zone and venue you might be for joining us today. Things in California. We had hail this morning. There was an earthquake. We're in the midst of a drought. Everything you've heard about California is really, we're just a big Potemkin village of 44 million people.
Well, we're glad you survived your stressful day, and we want to you to this hour where we can talk about future trends in technology and education. We'd like very, very briefly say a couple of words to introduce the Campus Computing Project. And what I'd like to do is ask you to pull out what you think are the major trends that you've identified in that report, most likely to have an impact, a transformative impact on higher education, technology in the medium term future.
Sure, great, thank you. And again, my thanks to all of you for joining us today. So just by a way of background that goes beyond the published biography, I frequently refer to myself as a defrocked academic or an academic Ronin, a samurai without a master. In a prior life, I was with a group that was doing big data before big data were big data, and that's the UCLA Higher Education Research Institute. Some of you may know this. For the annual survey of several 100,000 college students, a lot of what we know and a lot of the foundation for the conversation about institutional and student outcomes today is work that was launched by Sandy Aston, doing follow-up studies of tens of thousands of students, and I worked with that group for a number of years. I was the operating officer of that group in the 1980s. And so again, we were doing big data before big data were big data. At the risk of showing my age, we were doing multivariate analysis on IBM mainframe computers and stretching the computer because we needed a megabyte of memory to run regression analysis. Today, of course, we all throw away gigabyte chips because the 1 gigabyte or 2 gigabytes is just not enough memory. Campus computing launched in 1990 as a way to provide benchmarking data to colleges and universities and IT officers. How does my institution compare to our peers about IT planning and policy studies? So we are 25 years old. This will be the 27th survey in 2016. Our survey participants are typically CIOs or senior IT officers at some 500 2- and 4-year colleges across the United States. So we are, in one sense, the institutional memory. We began this survey when people were still talking about DOS, before the internet, before mobile, before a lot of the things that are part of the conversations that we have today about IT planning and policy issues. As I think about Brian's invitation to talk about our most recent survey, the 2015 survey, which went public at the EDUCAUSE conference, there are a couple of issues that jump out, some of which are new, some of which have been with us for a long time. When we ask IT officers to identify the single most important, to rate on a scale of 1 to 7, not important, very important, various IT issues, the number one issue, 4 out of 5 of our survey participants last fall, was the instructional integration of information technology. In other words, helping faculty use technology to enhance instruction. And that one has been a perennial favorite, number one on our list for a number of years. The irony, and I'll do a little bit of compare and contrast, the irony with that, of course, is that when we ask institutions, what have you done about review and promotion for technology? Not just am I using the LMS, but am I making efforts to, and I want to present my scholarly portfolio for review and promotion to include some technology. Less than 1 in 5 institutions are doing that. So not surprisingly, we're sending mixed messages about IT and instruction and IT faculty and professional portfolios. We see some very mixed signaling about user support. That's a perennial issue as well, also ranked very high. With that, the issue of hiring and retaining IT personnel. When we began to see that some years ago during the dot-com era, it was because people were being recruited off campus by the growing tech industry, going back to the late 1990s or now. Today, it's more a matter of colleges and universities because of budget challenges are not able to keep up with essentially competitive salaries for IT personnel, particularly in both large urban areas as well as small towns. People have options, and whatever the perceived or actual benefits are about being on a college campus, the mantra of doing more with less is just not, and doing it better, is just not sufficient. Our data document continuing budget cuts, even though in nominal ways we're through the worst of the recession and the budget cuts that played havoc not just with campuses but also with IT. We continue to see large numbers of institutions, particularly community colleges, experiencing budget cuts, even if now several years past the depth of the recession, if you will. And many campuses have almost 20% report that they're still experiencing mid-year budget cuts. So you have this compounding consequence of budget issues. We're seeing very slow movements to the cloud. While there's a public conversation on campus and in both the consumer and corporate sector about movement to the cloud, our document very slow movement to the cloud for what we would characterize as the high-value ERP applications. So there's some within LMS. When we look at the core ERP suite, student information systems, finance, development, HR, very slow movement, and even more so when we ask what's the likelihood that you will be on a cloud-based ERP application 5 years from now. Those numbers remain very small, for the most part, single digits. And there's the whole question about going digital. Brian alluded to a new survey that we released earlier this week, sponsored by the Independent College Bookstore Association. Some 2,900 faculty at 29 institutions, 2- and 4-year colleges and universities across the U.S. I think 2 sort of top-level messages from that. One, faculty do care about quality and cost when they make their choices. And two, the conversation about going digital in curriculum and course materials is not a matter of if, it certainly looms not large. That's really a matter of how. There's some, right now, sort of the leading benefit is perceived by faculty about going digital is cost. There are a lot of concerns about do digital course materials add value in terms of are they richer than their analog print materials, and do they enhance student outcomes? And we got some very interesting, you could, depend if you're an advocate, if you're agnostic or you're antagonistic to digital, you might interpret some of the data in other ways. But my guess is Brian's going to tag me on that. Let me stop and give the mic back to Brian.
Well, thank you very much for that really brisk overview covering an awful lot of ground. Let me just push a couple of questions at your way. Let me make a couple of quick observations. First, I'm amazed the Campus Computing Project is 26 years old. Its origin predates the web. I think that's extraordinary. That makes for a tremendous historical archive as well as a futures one. And the second is, I just want to chime in with a key point you made about the mixed signals about faculty use of technology. On the one hand, departments really passionately believe in increasing the faculty use of technology. On the other hand, they're not promoting it. And faculty infrastructures are not promoting it in departments for tenure promotion, hiring, and review. What do you think are going to be some of the impacts of these budget stresses you've described going forward? I mean, are we going to see underinvestment in infrastructure in campuses? Are we going to see IT staff already kind of begin to drop in either quantity or quality? What's going to happen with these budget stresses?
Brian, there's no question that there's significant stress. And we go through kind of ebb and flow on this. You were very kind in your comments to mention the 26-year history. You know, I mean, if you just look at the economy in general, let alone higher education, sort of every decade we go through a kind of a biblical couple of good years and a couple of awful years. We certainly saw this in the 1980s through the recession and the recovery, 1990s recession and recovery, the dot-com crash and recovery. You know, what was a little bit out of pattern, out of cycle, if you will, instead of the 7 and 7 biblical cycle, kind of a 5 and 5, is that just as we were coming out of the dot-com crash, you know, we went into the recession in 2008, 2009. And part of the challenge for higher education in general, for institutions, particularly for IT, is there is no let up in demand for resource or expectations and demand for resources and services, even as the budgets get whacked. You know, talk with IT officers and think about what's just happened during the recession period. So we've had the explosion of social and mobile. We've got a conversation underway about analytics and trying to do more and understand more about data, an effort to bring digital into the classroom, the whole use of video, podcasting, other kinds of issues, professional development. We see that budgets are getting whacked, as I mentioned, particularly in public sector and especially community college. And I think that one indicator of the stress, not just that IT officers are telling us that they're having a hard time hiring and retaining personnel, but also employee malfeasance. We've seen those numbers go up. In other words, when we ask about has your campus had a security incident, not just in terms of external people trying to hack your network or some other kind of security incident, for example, related to social media, which might be bullying, but the percentage of campuses across all sectors that report malfeasance, something related to the behavior of an employee. While those numbers are small, they're still there at 6 to 10% across sectors. That's a stress indicator. That's absolutely a stress indicator. And again, at the risk of redundancy, there's just no let up in terms of the expectation and demand. I mean, think about the bandwidth questions that are going on. I think it was last year or the year before, UT Austin was having public conversations about charging students who consume quote unquote excessive bandwidth. As campuses and particularly residential institutions become ISPs for their students, it's not just the academic work, if you will, but it's gaming and Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon Prime. It's part of the delivery mechanism. And do students who use, should those students be penalized? Or should those students pay an excess user fee? Because they're sucking bandwidth above and beyond the work that they might be doing related to their classes and other activities. That's just one example. User support would be a second. Let me mention a third that jumps out from both the survey data and also the Going Digital study. And that's the whole issue of digital accessibility. When we ask IT officers, do you do a, how would you assess the quality or the effectiveness of your efforts to serve disabled users? Those numbers are low. You can see that graph actually on a post on my digital tweet blog today. It was a kind of an encore summary of the Going Digital Summit. And we know that there's tremendous, if you will, tension, whatever term you'd like to use, about the issue of digital access. ADA is the law of the land. Institutions are obligated to provide digital access. It's more than just curb cuts in terms of the physical access to campus. When some years ago with WCET, we did a survey of some 200 operating officers, the senior campus official for online education, and asked, who's responsible for dealing with ADA issues and the materials for your online programs? And the largest bulk of the responsibility fell to individual faculty members or academic departments. That's a recipe for disaster and litigation. And we have seen, essentially with my informal scan of the archives of both Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle of Higher Education,
Yes.
Any campus that's been involved in litigation on this issue, the plaintiffs have typically won in terms of digital access. The day we released the Campus Computing WCET survey in 2011 was the day that Penn State was sued by the National Federation for the Blind about digital access in the context of their LMS platform. It's not going away.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Casey, let me pause you for a second, because I think you've just isolated a series of very, very powerful trends. And most recently, the question, growing user demands, the possibility of growing user abuses and security issues, and this accessibility problem, which I don't see declining in any time in the future. We have a question from one of our audience here, Mitch Weisberg, who asks, corporations currently use technology to bring efficiencies, either reducing cost or increasing output. Do you see universities using technologies in the same way?
Yeah, so Mitch, that's a great question. And for all of us who sat or slept through introductory economics and believe we understand sort of the basic relationship to technology and productivity, in theory, some increment of technology should result in productivity in one of three ways. The cost of providing a good or service goes down while the quality stays constant. The cost stays constant while the quality goes up. Or in the best of all circumstances, the cost goes down, then the quality goes up. I wouldn't want to sit through the faculty meeting where professors engage in the conversation about academic productivity. We see lots of instances, to be sure, over the last 3 decades, where technology has enhanced resources and services. I'm old enough, some of you in the audience are old enough to remember the days when students stood in long lines for registrations, in some cases with punch card. Today, that's largely online. Students of whatever ages can pay tuition with credit cards, buy t-shirts, textbooks, and tuition with credit cards, as opposed to lining up at the bursar's window or forwarding that forward. We have access to materials that in the past were just not possible, whether it's rich databases, periodicals, chem abstracts, journal stuff, or just the daily access to the New York Times that shows up on our windows each day that we can bring into our classrooms that our students can use. And yet, the other part of this, instructional costs haven't gone down. So you can argue, well, the quality has gone up, the costs haven't gone down. We see efforts on the part of institutions to contain the instructional costs on the personnel side with contingent personnel, part-time faculty, adjuncts. Doonesbury has done a great job lampooning this issue, painfully so, over the years. So it's a conundrum in one way, and we see other benefits on other sides. But again, depending on where you stand, you sit, and the perspective you take, if you're an advocate, if you're agnostic, or you're antagonistic, you're going to find a data point or an antidote to confirm some part of your epiphany on this. In fact, there's lots of epiphanies, there's lots of opinions, there's some evidence, but if you think about sort of the cri de coeur, or if you will, the accusation that comes from state legislatures, we've given you all this money for technology, why aren't instructional costs down, and why don't students know more? We don't have a good answer for that on just the instructional side and the learning outcome. And we see again, some of this manifested again with the faculty responses to the Going Digital survey, in terms of very few, less than a fifth, we had very small numbers in terms of faculty saying, Digital course materials improve student learning outcomes or bring added value material to course stuff. So, and you could argue that with that the glass is half empty or is that full. You could say, well, given where we are in this cycle, that's actually not bad. Alternatively, you could say, given the significant investment of effort and financial resources and institutional investment, we should be farther along.
Well, let me use your bridge, or let me glimpse your bridge and then walk across it. You referenced the Going Digital study, which again just came out a couple of days ago, and I really commend everyone. We have a link. We have links to it here, and I blogged about it, so there are notes there as well. And I think a takeaway was that most faculty in the United States are not moving towards digital materials, or if they are, they're moving very slowly. And they really see that problem of cost and quality. And the main one is they don't perceive high quality materials available out there. A second point of your study that was especially important to me was that when you asked about open education resources, a clear majority either had no idea what those were or didn't know of any materials in their own field. Let me ask, do you think we can envision a timeline, medium term or even a long-term future, where a growing number of faculty to adopt OER, that they materials out there, or do you think OER is going to remain for the near future?
Brian, let me respond to a couple of points in your last statement. The quality issue, I think, is in part, it's not a matter that the digital qualities that are available are not high quality. It's that they're not necessarily better. You know, I think that in many ways that there has been the hope or the expectation of the inference that by going digital, digital would be better than print. There would be added value, there would be richer content, there would be something about the magic of waving the digital wand on materials. You know, if you take a textbook and you pour it into a PDF, you still have the same textbook, whether it's a high quality textbook, a medium quality textbook, or a low quality textbook. And the question for me about both going digital in general and OER as a subset of digital is what I've characterized in a piece I wrote on my blog last fall, that an issue, it's not apples and oranges, it's apples and orchards, if you will. I mean, even though we had some compelling data from the Going Digital survey that ancillaries and supplements, whether it's for students or faculty, are not among the top three. In fact, less than 50% said the ancillaries and supplements for students or for faculty were very important. Were important or very important in their decisions about course materials. That's part of the landscape. We need to recognize that. The materials that publishers provide, particularly for first and second year lower division general education courses, the courses that do large numbers and large volumes in terms of headcount, but also in terms of course materials. So it's not necessarily the case that the digital materials are not as good. It's just that it may only be that they're as good as opposed to better, and we're hoping for better. The second part of that, as it relates to OER, is I think the larger challenge, there's a couple of challenges. One, obviously, is the recognition. We saw almost 40% in this survey. And I want to be very clear. This was not a representative survey. We had a large number of faculty respondents, 2,900, but it is not representative, but I still think it's informative. 60% of our survey participants were from universities, 8% from two-year colleges. Clearly not representative of the institutional and the faculty demography in higher ed. But the large number, I think, still makes it informative and very useful for part of this conversation. We hope to do it again. We hope to get a better representative sample for this. I think that the 40%, roughly 40% said that they had never heard of OER when we explained it. About 35% said they had heard of it but had no direct contact. And that left us with 25%. And of that 25%, 10% of that 25% said, yeah, I've touched OER but decided not to use it. Another 10% said I'm using OER, and 5% I'm not only using OER, but I'm trying to contribute to OER. But I think the OER challenge is not a matter of Ryan Alexander's widget book that comes from a commercial publisher against Casey Green's widget materials, which are available OER, but it's the ecosystem that goes beyond just the quote unquote textbook or the analog to the textbook, that those materials are still important. and understanding the faculty willingness to go to OER once they use it or see it, is still about the same core issues. When we asked faculty about going to OER, clear message as we had for course materials in general. Number one issue was quality. Number two issue was cost. Interestingly, the number three issue in terms of what might tilt them that way was the absence of copyright restrictions to start tinkering with stuff. I don't have to deal with copyright if I want to use OER materials in my class, for accessibility, copyright clearance, other kinds of stuff. I can do the update. But again, it's a small number. And again, these things may snowball. This is not a static environment. It's going to move. But I think the OER community has to deal, one, with the issue that it's the orchard issue. It's not just the apples to apples comparison. And two, the OER community is also going to deal with digital accessibility. There's a very clear, when we look in aggregate with the data from the Going Digital Survey, if I look at the stuff from campus computing, there's a very clear message about large numbers of faculty, and particularly in community colleges, express concern that their students didn't have easy access or own the platforms needed to use digital course materials. In other words, they don't own notebooks, they don't own tablets. And just an hour or two in a lab, particularly for a part-time student, especially in a community college, isn't sufficient when we think about the way students use course materials. And it's just, phones may not be adequate in terms of being able to access it on your smartphone, particularly if it's a small screen. So one, you've got an access issue, which says that if large numbers of students don't have access to the technology, the students who might most benefit are not able to do so in terms of the cost savings. And two, that extends to the issues we were talking before about accessibility. Well, commercial publishers, which have been the target of a lot of the accessibility advocates in terms of litigation, in terms of some other initiatives that we experienced at Amazon and some institutions working with pilot projects with Kindles years ago had, when they got letters from the Department of Justice, Department of Education, and Arizona State was sued by the National Federation for the Blind, want to put pressure on publishers to accommodate the needs of ADA and other kinds of requirements. If individual faculty members are essentially contributing to the OER archive, most faculty members are course designers. They may be able to write a textbook, they may be able to write materials, but they're not trained or sensitive to the nuances of what do I do to also make this ADA compatible, ADA accessible for certain populations. And that too is part of the lay of the land and law.
Casey, let me pause you for a moment, because I think those are extremely important forces that are going to be shaping what happens to OER going forward. And I think they connect back to a point you made earlier that most accessibility, I mean accessibility in the sense of disability, is not done programmatically yet. That's a very, very major issue. I think this ties into some themes that have occurred in this forum. Richard DeMillo and Audrey Waters have both made key arguments about social accessibility, economic accessibility, that as American society becomes increasingly unequal, as we have a growing proportion of people who are living below the middle class, it seems like that's going to become an increasing challenge to meet them with the technological materials that we're teaching with. We had a question from one person in the audience who just stepped out. Hope he comes back. Brian Carter, if we'd like to hear from you. But I want to, while we're waiting for Brian to come back, let me ask you if you could take one more step. Casey, you mentioned that there is no age breakdown in the faculty use of digital materials, which really surprised me because generally speaking, we can see that the older people get in the United States, the less likely they are to use digital technologies, generally speaking. There are all kinds of exceptions, but they're obvious. But you found no age at all. That age was irrelevant in determining this.
Yeah, I went line by line.
Did you discern any factor or shape that helped nudge faculty towards digital materials?
Yeah, we saw some differences, not surprisingly, by campus sector. Differences between community colleges, baccalaureate master's institutions, and universities on a number of these issues. And in fact, I mean, the irony that when we looked at the institutional data was that in some ways, surprisingly, given the issues about access to the platforms essential for digital, community college faculty were somewhat more supportive and positive about going digital than were their counterparts in universities. Folks at baccalaureate master's institutions were in many ways the proverbial middle child in the middle between the two groups. And again, I want to emphasize this is not a representative sample. We had about 250 faculty from 5 community colleges as part of this, far more than that, orders, several multiples of that in terms of our university population, but I think it's informative. Still, it's not representative. When I went line by line through the survey data, looking at the responses by age group, 35 and under, 35 to 44, 44, those kinds of questions, there was not a consistent pattern in terms of the responses of folks by age group. There may have been 1 or 2 anomalies, but 1 or 2 you might expect, but to look for patterns in terms of something by age group. The expectation is that younger faculty might be more inclined, older faculty might be less inclined. I just didn't see that in any consistent way in terms of an embracing or being hostile to digital course materials and the notion of going digital.
Sure. But community colleges seem, generally speaking, more interested in open education resources than the universities in comprehensive baccalaureates.
Right. As a group, the faculty who are based in community colleges seemed a little more positive in their assessments of going digital and digital course materials than were their counterparts in universities. And the irony there, of course, is that again, if you think about the population and access to digital, in terms of platforms, and the community college faculty were also far more likely than their counterparts in other sectors to express concern that their students didn't have access to digital course materials, digital platforms that would enable easy and frequent access to digital course materials.
Well, I wonder, do you think that this is going to lead to a greater push from mobile, for content on mobile devices, since we know, statistically speaking, the less wealthy one is, the more likely they are to use phones for internet access. And it's especially true by race, where Blacks and Latinos in the United States are much more likely to use cell phones than whites are for a variety of functions.
Well, I don't think there's any question about the role of mobile. We began to see mobile play a role in higher ed, beginning in 2009 when we saw the first mobile apps for higher education. And whether it's instructional materials or institutional resources, I think that certainly our data suggests that there's a playing catch up to what goes on in the consumer economy. We've been tracking the deployment of mobile apps through campus computing, and in 4-year institutions, most institutions have by now launched mobile apps. Those numbers are about 2/3 in community colleges. But when we ask CIOs, how would you rate the effectiveness of your mobile deployment? Barely 20% say very effective. And that has consequences, whether it's institutional services, whether it's registering, getting other services about your campus on your mobile app, let alone the instructional side, access to the LMS, digital course materials on a screen, whatever size that might be. As I've traveled outside the US, we certainly see a lot more mobile and mobile learning going on, particularly in Asia. But there's a tendency in Asia also more towards phablets, 7, 8-inch screen phones that we see here in the US at present. Now, that may change again with the next generation of phones, or that may change with the next generation of apps on the phones that dominate the US market and are common among college students. Tablets represent a moving target, I think. And certainly when we ask CIOs, as you think about the digital puck, what's more important in your planning for IT infrastructure? They clearly indicate it's tablets and phones over laptops. But for many students, and particularly for students who are not affluent, the tablet is a luxury. If you should think of sort of the priority, as you alluded to a few moments ago, Brian, it's a laptop and or a phone. And depending on your circumstances, it might be a phone over a laptop initially, and then you try to use campus labs. Tablets are a luxury, absolutely, even though you get the larger screen size, and you may be able to do more things on a tablet than you can do on your phone in terms of interactivity and other kinds of things. And then the question with that as well is, even as we see public Wi-Fi in some areas, somebody's paying for the connectivity in terms of a mobile plan, unless you're getting essentially free mobile on campus. FCC, I saw in a headline earlier this week, is looking at launching wireless initiatives in low-income areas, particularly as it relates to education, as an extension of potentially E-rate services that serve K-12 schools. There's the digital divide lingers and has real consequences, not just in K-12, but also higher ed, particularly if and as we move to more digital course materials.
Well, I hear you. Just let me offer two personal notes. One is that I live in a state which has very, very poor connectivity. We have very slow bandwidth, and we also have very relatively low rollout of mobile networks and pickup of mobile devices. So this is Vermont, which is a very rural state, and the rural-urban divide is very, very strong when it comes to mobile and to broadband. The second personal note is that I think Casey, you and I have been talking about this for some time. Around 2000 or 2001, I became very interested in the use of mobile for education. And I spent the next 4 years telling people in the United States this is a big deal and people should pay attention to it. And most people said, it's not a big deal. We've got laptops, we have desktops. It was only once the iPhone came out that Americans said, oh, yeah, mobile phones, and then went bananas for it. We started to catch up with the rest of the world. Um, let me ask you to take a look at another trend, Casey, one that you've spoken about quite passionately, and one that's very central to technology and education, which is the learning management system, the LMS, or what in
Yeah.
Europe they call the virtual learning environment.
Mhm.
And you've documented extensively just how widespread LMS rollout is in the United States. But you said that it's not very useful pedagogically, that the LMS is an administrative tool, not a learning one. How do you
Well,
see the LMS evolving the next 5 to 10 years?
yeah, let me clarify that. I don't believe it's an administrative tool. I think it's a dissemination platform. If you think back to
Ah,
the early arrival of the LMS, late 1990s, it became a way for faculty who couldn't do code to put stuff up on the web. And we saw, a lot of experimentation. It sort of looked like the automobile industry in the early days: steam, electric, combustion engine. Slowly, and particularly in higher ed, it kind of winnowed down to a couple of different platforms. And and as and I'm on record. I wrote this in 2004 with the announcement about the emergence of Sakai, when the Mellon Foundation essentially acted as a venture capitalist to help launch what was going to be, many thought, only one flavor of an open source LMS, Sakai, and then ironically we wind up with two, Sakai and Moodle. The
mhm.
LMS is, if you think about it as a business school case, it's a mature market with immature products. And by that I meant that by 2004, almost every campus had a license for at least one LMS. The deployment, the percentage of campuses, of classes that were using the LMS was still under 50%, according to the best estimates we got from CIOs. And the depth of deployment was even lower. I mean, we know that many classes may use the LMS, but that may range dramatically from just using it as a way to post a syllabus on the web to using a lot of the features and functions that the LMS may do. It's like a spreadsheet or a word processor. 80% of the activity, excuse me, is typically in 20% of the application. But it has become ubiquitous. Our numbers suggest anywhere from 65 to 75% of classes at large are using the LMS, but we still don't know the depth of deployment at any kind of national level. And either the campuses or the technology providers that might have that data, I've not seen that public yet. I think it still remains an immature, a more maturing, but still largely immature or evolving technology. Several years ago, I wrote a piece about the LMS 3.0, 2009, 2010, that sort of analytics was sort of the next leap as we began to see the LMS get as part of the analytic gumbo, whether it was extracting data from the LMS. We made a lot of efforts in general, I mean, across the board in higher ed during the 2000s, trying to answer the question, well, does the LMS in and of itself as an application improve learning outcomes? And quite honestly, we had a lot of crappy research, small studies trying to answer that question. And it wasn't until we got some data from Purdue, was we got Kat Finnegan, who then one time at the University of Georgia, now Virginia Community College System, did large multi-campus, large population studies looking at the LMS. And I think what we learned is that the LMS is a platform it's another delivery platform. And ultimately, this may sound flippant, it's a supermarket scanner in one sense as well. Good, bad, or otherwise, it's kind of an unobtrusive metric to tell us a little bit about time on task. Now, admittedly, students can defeat it or can have the LMS open while they're doing other things. But it is a metric that increasingly campuses are using to go into the analytic gumbo as they track students about how are you proceeding through your first year widgets course in terms of time on task, in terms of midterms, other times. And we're seeing campuses, 3 weeks in, sending reminder notices, warning notices to students. Hey, Casey, you're in the widgets class. We're delighted that you are, but we're sort of tracking your time on task and how you did on the midterm and some other indicators. And based on your student profile and based on students like you and what we know in terms of the analytic work that we've done and how you did on the last midterm, you're on a troubled path at this point. You need to sort of up your game. It's basic Bloom. Students who spend more time on task do better, regardless of their ability levels. And I think we're seeing the analytic providers make a major push on analytics. We're seeing the ERP providers trying to take the time on task data out of the LMS and push that into the Gumbo as well. They're all adding a lot of features and functionality. There's kind of a leapfrog process. One provider adds something, the next provider, it's software, so it's not long before it shows up in the next release of somebody else. There's certainly generations of this. Sort of Blackboard in one sense as being the lingering first generation provider going through its own iterations into what is now Ultra. D2L just made an announcement about its next release. Canvas is the new kid on the block. Efforts on the part of Moodle and Sakai as well to constantly do these upgrades of features and functionality. And that's not going to go away. I think the other thing that's striking about the LMS is if you think about the LMS as a kind of, now being ubiquitous and core, campuses are not going to terminate their LMS contracts because of financial issues. They're going to try that's not going to happen. The question is, how do we get more value out of the LMS? How do we get faculty to do more with it? And how do we upgrade it to make it more user-friendly and sticky in terms of a sense that I have of semantic remorse. We began by calling these course management platforms or learning management platforms, and they were kind of on the faculty side. How do I get stuff up? I think that the semantic remorse that I hear is, gee, we ought to be calling them student engagement platforms. How do we make them sticky so students spend more time on task in these environments, and there's better materials to help them in their courses?
I think semantic remorse is the best phrase I've heard all day. That's terrific. Casey, that gives us a really detailed way of looking at the medium-term future. Looking at LMS is a very rich, detailed way. We have a questioner in the audience, Mitch Weisberg. Shindig folks, can you put Mitch on the spotlight and bring him to the stage? Knock me off, and he can ask Casey directly.
Hi, Casey.
Hi, Mitch.
So I didn't expect to be up here today, but here I am. So my initial question was that there are companies and organizations that seem to be putting the universities to shame with the use of digital content or blended content. Companies like General Assembly, where they're taking people in a matter of a few months, kind of revamping their whole careers through a combination of face-to-face learning and online learning and printed content and digital content. And just I guess the question is are universities coming up with a response? Are they do you see them kind of looking for partnerships with organizations like that, or do you think that this is just something that exists for a small portion of the population and universities don't even have to consider it?
Mitch, I think that's a good question. And it's part of the larger issue about outsourcing and competitive environments. We see this at the back end as well in terms of students who have already earned baccalaureate degrees, either going back to community colleges for a couple of courses to learn or enhance a tech portfolio, or going to coding institutes and essentially reinventing themselves after graduation, and at least short term, seemingly to do well, but we don't know what how long that short-term training is going to carry forward. Hopefully it will go well. Those folks will constantly reinvent and add to their portfolios. Excuse me. I don't think institutions can ignore it. I think at the same time, institutions need to understand it in terms of is there a magic about that? It's something unique. Is that an organizational magic? Is it a curricular magic? Is it instructional magic? What's the magic wand that's being waved here in this environment? Institutions. Let me add one other thing. Understand, higher education is incredibly risk averse. Individual faculty members as a group, not necessarily you, Mitch, not necessarily the group we've got assembled here, are also risk averse. But I think they also act out of enlightened self-interest. And at least in the almost 30 years I've been watching technology, I'd marked that from the beginning, sort of 1986 when Steve Gilbert and I wrote the New Computing in Higher Education article that was published in Change, arguing at this time it's different, it's not a fad. Faculty act out of enlightened self-interest, but those 30 years in technology and almost everything else in higher ed still marked by too much epiphany and opinion and not enough evidence. And if the General Assemblies and others of the world bring forward evidence that this stuff works, I think that will act as a catalyst for change in many institutions or many departments about how we do better. I think at the same time, we need to change the data conversation in terms of going that direction from one of what you've done wrong to how you do better. In the broad conversation about analytics and in the general conversation and in the specific conversation that you're alluding to in terms of sort of restructuring the gumbo of curriculum in terms of how students learn and the resources and services and the kind of course structures that we offer to students. Does that help?
That helps. I mean, for me, I look at the types of courses that something like a General Assembly, and I just use them as an example, at really being very different. Whereas people were saying 10 years ago, well, look at all these for-profits and they're eating the university's lunch. But the fact that, again, this is my opinion, but the for-profits proved particularly adept at getting government money to funnel in as loans to students and then pocketing the money, and the students got relatively little out of it. Whereas these new courses really do seem to be things that propel people to much better careers faster than other mechanisms in the past. They're very good at assessing, teaching, intermediating with the students when students are falling behind. They just seem to be working.
Yeah, there's a metaphor that you can pull from economics or biology that I think may help to explain this a little bit, and a little bit of the history of higher education as well. You think about the history of higher education from the founding of Harvard. The established orders at each point along the way looked at the new arrivals as barbarians at the gate.
Yeah.
The colonial colleges looked at the introduction of applied curricula through the land-grant colleges as barbarians at the gate. Community colleges were barbarians at the gate. The for-profits were barbarians at the gate. Online learning was certainly viewed by many as a barbarian at the gate. And yet, if you take an economic metaphor, as markets grow, they segment. If you look at a biological model, as organisms get more complex, you get specialization of the cells. I think some of this is going on. I think also, again, this is not necessarily the world that I came of age in as an undergraduate in the 1970s, more the world of my children. The world of one job is long gone. We have to constantly reinvent ourselves and pour into our portfolios. That may be part of the attraction of the MOOCs at one level. But the evidence of the MOOCs, the New York Times notwithstanding, declaring 2012 the year of the MOOCs, is they have crappy completion rates. And they have crappy completion rates even when you start to sort of parse the definition of completion, as some folks at Coursera and elsewhere have tried to do by trying to parse it by intentionality. None of us who work in more conventional institutions could get by with 27 or 30 or 35% completion rates. But again, this is voluntary. There's no hand in your pocket. There's no hand in your back. A lot of it's closer. And I know I'm going to piss some people off by saying this. I mean, at one level,
you piss people off? You're kidding.
The MOOCs are more like a PBS, a Ken Burns PBS special or Oprah's book club. It's voluntary. There's benefit. But I can't take my Oprah's book club membership card to your office, Mitch, and say I'm a liberal arts major because I've read the Oprah canon. I've benefited from that in many ways. And there are organizations, clearly, and many of them are technological, who are using the MOOCs, and students who are regular undergraduates or graduate students using the MOOCs as a way of supplementing their existing portfolios. All that's well and good. And eventually, we're evolving the larger conversation about credentials that goes beyond traditional degrees. But that's still lots of moving pieces in an evolving conversation. And on the money side that you alluded to, the for-profits, that's an evolving public policy issue about what we pay for with public dollars. We know how to do that, good, bad, or otherwise, and we've done that with degrees historically. We're having a harder time, but it's not, we're going to have to start to address it in terms of dealing with these other forms of training and credentialing.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for doing this, and thank you, Brian, for bringing me up. Brian, you should probably come back up and bring me down.
I can certainly do that. Thank you, Mitch, for being on the spot. That was a lovely question. And Casey, that was a terrific answer. I really liked your threefold metaphor: barbarians at the gate, segmented kits, and organisms and more specialized. Um, we have time for one more question from the audience. Does anybody have one more that they would like to ask Casey? If you want to raise your hand, so that's again the bottom right of the screen, click that raise hand button. That'll bring you up on stage. That'll tell us you want to come on stage like Mitch just did. Or click ask if you would like to just put up a little bit of text. While you're thinking about that.
If we had campus computing t-shirts, I'd offer one for the next question, but we don't.
Well, that's a thought. We haven't built forum swag yet, but
yeah,
there's something to think about. Casey, let me ask one question of my own about the future in a very narrow way. What's next for Campus Computing Project, and what's next for your Going Digital research?
Fair questions, Brian. Campus computing hopefully will continue. I think there's still a couple of good cycles that we do. The project continues to evolve. Obviously, we're not asking about DOS the way we once were in 1990. We are very dependent, honestly, I invite your audiences, I invite other audiences. We're dependent upon the kindness and at times the loyal opposition of strangers who say, why aren't you asking about this? Our survey goes out each year in draft format to a couple hundred folks in both the campus community CIOs, as well as to some of our corporate sponsors. We're fortunate to have some 35 firms who pay a modest subscription fee to help underwrite what we do. And it's that iterative process that helps keep us, if you will, on or ahead of some of the curves of the technology. So we'll continue to do that. We focus, again, on policy and planning. I know that many folks also use the EDUCAUSE core data stuff. I would like to think that we complement, that we don't compete with what they do. They ask a lot of detailed questions that they're more sort of bits and bytes level, a lot more detail about personnel. We don't go there because we don't want to duplicate their efforts. And as far as Going Digital, this is a pilot project, if you will, with the independent college bookstore associations. Those are typically large campuses that are still managed by their institutions. I'm very fortunate that they approached us to do this. Their interest was not in a self-serving project that would affirm the role of the bookstore. In fact, there were only 4 questions about the role of the bookstore on the survey. It was really about Going Digital. And the response to the survey, which went public earlier this week, seems to be that we're probably going to go forward with this, hopefully on an annual basis, bringing in new questions and doing updates on the ones that we have, hopefully with a larger population that will get us from being informative, getting us from being not just interesting and informative, but also to being representative, better data, richer data within and across sectors.
That's terrific. As a fan, I have to say I'm looking forward to the latest from the campus computing, and also I really look forward to where Going Digital goes next. On Twitter, there were some questions about how you defined OER. Maybe we can follow up on that. We're out of time right now. We're at the precise end of the hour, so I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap this up. Casey, let me just thank you so much for such a generous, rich conversation, very thought-provoking, lots of information. I think we could definitely follow up and pursue any of these points in greater detail. Thank you again for your time, and good luck surviving the landslides, tornadoes, hurricanes, and governors of California.
Brian, my thanks to you and all of you who took time out from your day to join us for this conversation. I am most appreciative. Time does not come easy. Thank you.
Oh, that comes well in your case. Shindig, folks, if you could bring up the slides, just to point you to, if you could skip to the next slide, just let you know on the right, while it's coming up on the right side of the screen, you see links to my Future Trends report and to Casey's Campus Computing Project, so you can follow those up, as I strongly recommend. Next week on the forum, we have Will Richardson, a longtime friend and a really amazing person who works in the secondary school world. Will is one of the first great edu-bloggers, a man who has written, consulted widely. We're going to be focusing on how technology is changing high school and how it's changing the K-12 environment as well as higher education. So be sure to click on willardson.com or modernlearners.com to learn more about his work. And in the meantime, let me thank you all so much for your attention, for your questions and comments. We're going to follow this session up by putting it on YouTube along with a blog post with my notes. The YouTube of last week's session along with my notes are about to appear. And until then, we'll see you next week on the next Future Transform. Thank you to Shindig for all of your generous support and help. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.